They declared themselves eternal, untouchable, divine, until humanity shattered that delusion with fire and steel. For 3,000 cycles, the Ascendant Collective had ruled the outer spiral arms with absolute authority, their crystalline vessels gliding through space like monuments to their supposed immortality. They called themselves gods, and across 100 conquered worlds, trembling populations had no choice but to believe them. Their technology seemed miraculous, their lifespan stretched beyond counting, and their warriors regenerated from wounds that would obliterate any other species. They had crushed the Valric resistance in a single solar rotation, absorbed the Korthan defense fleets without losing a single ship, and turned the proud Mesrani civilization into little more than tribute-paying servants. When they turned their gaze toward the small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, they expected nothing different. They expected submission, worship, and the sweet taste of another species acknowledging their divine superiority. They had no idea what they were about to awaken. Humanity had been watching from the shadows of their home system, studying every battle, analyzing every broadcast, measuring every boastful declaration the collective made. The Council of Earth had voted an emergency session, their chambers filled with tension so thick it could choke the air from the room. The Admiral sat at the center table, fingers steepled, eyes dark with something that might have been rage or might have been cold calculation. Around that table sat representatives from every nation that had once been divided, now united by a simple truth. Extinction didn't care about old borders. The scientists stood at the holographic display, pointing to the energy signatures that made the collective seem invincible, those strange pulses that allowed their bodies to reform, their ships to phase through attacks, their commanders to laugh at weapons that should have reduced them to atoms. But the scientist had found something, a frequency pattern that shouldn't exist, a mathematical impossibility that somehow kept repeating in every scan. The youngest member of the council, barely more than a technician who had been promoted for brilliance rather than rank, had spoken the words that changed everything. The regeneration wasn't natural. The immortality was engineered. And engineering, no matter how advanced, could be broken. Humanity had spent 2 centuries hidden behind a gravitational veil, a technology so subtle that even the self-proclaimed gods never detected it. They had learned to bend space itself, to create pockets of reality where their ships could move faster than physics should allow, where their weapons could strike from angles that didn't technically exist. While the collective had focused on making themselves appear invulnerable, humanity had focused on making themselves invisible. While the enemy had built monuments to their own glory, humans had built weapons in silence. The shipyards orbiting Mars had worked without rest, constructing vessels that looked nothing like traditional warships, craft that hummed with gravitational energies that would make a physicist weep with either joy or terror. When the collective's first wave arrived at the edge of human space, they broadcast their standard ultimatum: kneel or burn, worship or die. The commander of the flagship barely paid attention to the response, already mentally dividing the spoils of another effortless conquest. They had sent their enforcers down to the surface, those towering figures wrapped in energy fields that had never been breached, expecting to see populations fleeing in panic or prostrating themselves in desperate prayer. Instead, they found empty cities and a transmission that contained only 3 words: "You were warned." The human warship that emerged from behind the moon wasn't large by collective standards. It didn't gleam with precious metals or broadcast its presence with arrogant light displays. It simply appeared, tearing through the fabric of folded space like a blade through silk, and when it fired its first salvo, reality itself seemed to scream. The gravitational lance didn't just destroy the collective shields, it inverted them, turned their own defensive technology into crushing pressure that compacted their crystalline hulls like paper in a fist. The enforcers on the ground, those supposedly immortal warriors, felt their regeneration fields collapse under waves of gravitational distortion. For the first time in 3,000 cycles, they felt something they had forgotten existed: pain. Then fear. Then, for many of them, death. The commander's final transmission, sent in the microseconds before the flagship's core imploded, contained only confusion and disbelief. They had studied the species. Humans were supposed to be fragile, primitive, divided. The reports had shown a civilization barely united, with technology generations behind the collective's magnificence. The commander died without understanding the truth. Humanity's greatest weapon had never been strength, but the ability to learn from every enemy that had ever underestimated them. Now, as the debris of that first collective fleet drifted through the void and emergency broadcast, the High Council chamber existed in a space between dimensions, a pocket of reality that the collective had carved out centuries ago as proof of their transcendence. Here, surrounded by walls that shifted between states of matter, the 7 ruling members gathered in physical form for the first time since the Great Unification War. The eldest among them, a being whose consciousness had transferred through 43 bodies across millennia, stared at the tactical display with something approaching the emotion lesser species, called dread. The numbers didn't lie, even if the implications seemed impossible. 17 warships gone. Not damaged, not retreating, simply erased from existence as if they had never been. The warlord slammed crystalline appendages against the table, sending fractures of light cascading through the dimensional walls. This being had conquered systems, had personally overseen the subjugation of species that had fought with every ounce of desperation they possessed. Victory had always been inevitable, a mathematical certainty written into the fabric of their existence. But the recordings from the battle told a different story, one that made the warlord's regenerative matrix fluctuate with what might have been the ancestor of fear. The human vessel had moved through space in ways that violated their understanding of physics. It hadn't dodged their weapons. It had simply existed in places where the attacks couldn't reach, slipping through folds in gravity that shouldn't have been possible to create, let alone navigate. The scholar, whose mind had absorbed the knowledge of 400 conquered civilizations, played the final transmission from the commander over and over. There had to be something they missed, some explanation that fit within the collective's worldview. Humans were supposed to be young, barely spacefaring, a species that had only recently stopped killing each other over resources and ideology. The intelligence reports had been thorough. Earth had been surveyed from a distance, its technological level assessed and categorized as primitive. Radio signals, nuclear fission, chemical rockets, all the markers of a species still crawling toward the stars. But those reports were 70 cycles old, compiled when the collective had deemed humanity too insignificant to warrant immediate attention. 70 cycles. In that time, humans had apparently learned to weaponize gravity itself. The empath, whose role was to sense the emotional patterns of conquered populations and predict resistance movements, spoke with a voice that rippled through multiple frequencies. This one had felt the moment of the commander's death, had experienced the shock and confusion that had flooded through the collective consciousness of the fleet. But beneath that, buried in the final thoughts of the enforcers who died on Earth's surface, there had been something else. Recognition. As if in those last moments, facing an enemy they couldn't regenerate from, they had remembered what it meant to be mortal. The empath confessed that the sensation had been disturbing enough to cause temporary dissonance in their own matrix, a feedback loop of fear that had taken hours to suppress. Around the galaxy, the tributary species were already whispering. The Valric resistance cells, thought to be completely crushed, had started broadcasting messages again. The Corthan survivors were reforming their scattered fleets. Even the Mesrani, who had been beaten into such complete submission that they barely qualified as sentient anymore, were raising their heads and looking toward the stars with something that might have been hope. The collective's control had always relied on perception as much as power. They were immortal, unstoppable, divine. But immortal gods didn't lose 17 ships to a single human warship. Divine beings didn't send panic transmissions begging for reinforcement. The tactician brought up projections, cascading possibilities that filled the chamber with light. If humanity possessed one such vessel, they likely possessed more. If they had hidden this technology for 70 cycles, what else might they be concealing? The gravitational weapons suggested an understanding of space-time manipulation that rivaled or exceeded the collective's own achievements. Worse, humanity had demonstrated something the collective had never needed to develop: tactical cunning born from facing extinction. Every species the collective had encountered either submitted quickly or died slowly. None had ever hidden, waited, studied their enemy with the patience of predators who knew they only got one chance to strike. The eldest called for a vote on the response. The warlord demanded immediate overwhelming force, send 100 fleets, turn the human home system into debris, show the galaxy that this was merely an aberration. The scholar argued for caution, for more intelligence gathering, for understanding how humanity had achieved this impossible leap. The others were divided, their confidence shaken by something none of them had experienced, in living memory doubt. They were gods, yes, but gods who had just learned they could bleed. Meanwhile, in the depths of Earth's military command, the admiral stood before a wall. The engineer stood in the observation deck of the orbital construction facility, watching welding drones complete the final touches on the 7th warship of the month. Below, Earth rotated in peaceful blues and greens, completely unaware that their entire species now balanced on the edge of a knife. Most civilians still believed the official story, that the collective fleet had been a scout group that retreated after seeing humanity's defensive capabilities. They didn't know about the bodies that had been recovered from the wreckage, the crystalline remains that had been studied in laboratories, buried 3 kilometers beneath the surface. They didn't know that those supposedly immortal beings had screamed as they died, their final moments captured on audio feeds that the military would never release to the public. The engineer had listened to those recordings once. That had been enough. In the medical bay of the prototype warship, now docked for repairs and upgrades, the medic examined tissue samples that defied every principle of biology they had ever learned. The collective's regeneration wasn't magic, despite how it appeared to the tributary species they had conquered. It was technology merged with flesh at a level so fundamental that separating the two had proven nearly impossible. Each cell in their bodies connected to a quantum network that stored genetic information and repair protocols. When damaged, the network simply rebuilt them using energy harvested from dimensional fluctuations. Ingenious, elegant, and absolutely terrifying in its implications. The collective hadn't just defeated aging and disease, they had turned death itself into a temporary inconvenience. But the gravitational weapons had done something unexpected. They hadn't just destroyed the physical bodies of the enforcers. They had disrupted the quantum network itself, shredded the dimensional connections that allowed regeneration to occur. For the first time in millennia, members of the collective had died true deaths, their consciousness scattered beyond any hope of recovery. The medic wondered if that was why the High Council seemed paralyzed with indecision. Perhaps when you had lived for thousands of cycles, believing yourself eternal, the sudden reintroduction of mortality was more devastating than any weapon. 3 systems away, on a tributary world whose name had been replaced with a numerical designation centuries ago, the rebel leader gathered her cell in the ruins of what had once been a temple to their forgotten gods. The broadcast from Earth had reached them through channels the collective thought they controlled, but resistance movements had always been better at information flow than their oppressors realized. She played the footage for her fighters, showing them the moment when the human warship had emerged from folded space and reduced the supposedly invincible fleet to expanding clouds of debris. Some of her people wept. Others laughed with a manic edge that spoke of hope too painful to fully embrace. They had fought the collective for 6 generations, watching their parents and children die in endless cycles of rebellion and suppression. Now, for the first time, they had proof that the gods could fall. The rebel leader knew better than to let hope run unchecked. Humanity had won a single battle, not the war. The collective controlled thousands of systems, commanded resources that dwarfed entire galactic sectors, and possessed weapons that humanity might not even know existed yet. But she also knew something about empires built on fear and perceived invincibility. Once the illusion cracked, once the subjected populations realized their masters could bleed, the cracks would spread faster than any military force could contain. She began composing messages to other resistance cells, careful coded transmissions that would look like commercial traffic to collective sensors. The fire had been lit. Now it needed fuel. Back in the command center beneath Earth's surface, the strategist moved pieces across a holographic star map, like a chess player contemplating moves 20 turns ahead. Intelligence suggested the collective was amassing fleets at 3 staging points, preparing for either a massive assault or a strategic withdrawal. The uncertainty was intentional. Humanity had seeded enough false information into collective surveillance networks to make them question their own intelligence gathering. Let them wonder if Earth had 10 warships or 10,000. Let them debate whether humanity's gravitational technology was limited to short-range weapons or if it extended to system-wide defensive grids. The truth was somewhere in between, and the strategist had no intention of clarifying matters. The diplomat reviewed first contact protocols that now seemed laughably naive. Humanity had prepared for decades to join the galactic community as equals, to share knowledge and culture with species that had been traveling the stars, while humans were still figuring out agriculture. Instead, they had discovered a galaxy divided between gods and slaves, with no middle ground available. The collective didn't negotiate with species they considered inferior, and they considered everyone inferior. The tributary species were too broken or too fearful to risk alliance with an unknown factor. Humanity stood alone, and the diplomat was trying to find a path forward that didn't end with either submission or extinction. The problem was that the collective had made submission impossible the moment they sent their ultimatum. Kneel or burn. No negotiation, no compromise, no acknowledgement that humanity might have any right to exist as a free species. They had made it existential from the start, and humans had a particular talent for survival when backed into corners. The captain of the prototype warship walked through corridors, still scorched from the battle, running fingers along metal that had been heated to near melting point by weapons that shouldn't have been able to touch them at all. The shields had held, but barely. The gravitational lances had performed beyond specifications, but they had also drained the ship's power reserves to critical levels. If the collective had sent 2 fleets instead of 1, if the battle had lasted 10 minutes longer, humanity's great triumph might have become their funeral pyre. The captain knew what the admiral wouldn't say publicly. They had won because the enemy hadn't expected resistance. Next time, the collective would come prepared. The question was whether humanity could adapt faster than an empire that had spent 3. The physicist's report landed on the admiral's desk at 0300 hours, marked with security clearances that made even senior command staff uncomfortable. By 0400, every member of Earth's military council sat in the emergency bunker, staring at holographic projections that seemed to come from science fiction rather than actual sensor data. The structures existed in dimensional folds that shouldn't be accessible to either human or collective technology. Vast geometric patterns that stretched across light years of compressed space. They weren't natural formations. Nothing in nature built perfect mathematical sequences that repeated across 11 dimensions. The scientist who had discovered the collective's regeneration weakness now looked like someone who had opened a door they desperately wished they could close. The gravitational weapons had torn holes in reality, brief windows measured in microseconds, but the sensors had been fast enough to capture what existed on the other side. Architecture, not the organic crystalline structures of the collective, but something older, precise, and utterly inhuman in its geometry. Worse, the structures had responded to the weapon's fire, not aggressively, not defensively, but with what the analysis suggested was curiosity. Something had noticed humanity's attack, and that something had been silently watching the galaxy for longer than either humans or the collective had existed. The youngest council member, the technician whose brilliance had started this entire cascade, asked the question everyone else was afraid to voice. If these structures had been there all along, hidden in dimensional space, why hadn't the collective encountered them? The collective had been using dimensional technology for millennia, had been folding space and harvesting energy from quantum fluctuations since before humans discovered fire. The answer, when the physicist provided it, made the temperature in the room seem to drop. The collective's technology was gentle, carefully designed to avoid disturbing the fabric of space-time. Humanity's weapons were crude by comparison, wielded with the desperation of a species that had no choice but to swing hard or die. They had kicked down a door the collective had been carefully tiptoeing around for 3,000 cycles. On the collective High Council's dimensional platform, the scholar had discovered the same data through their own sensor networks, pulled from the wreckage of ships that humanity didn't realize were still transmitting in their final moments. The revelation turned their debate about humanity into something far more urgent. The eldest, whose memory stretched back to the founding of their civilization, spoke of old warnings, legends that the collective's ancestors had encountered something in the deep places between dimensions. something that had allowed them to exist, to thrive, to build their empire, but only as long as they remained quiet. The warlord dismissed this as superstition, the mental decay of a consciousness that had lived too long. But even as the words left the crystalline form, doubt flickered in patterns of light across the chamber. The empaths suddenly convulsed, their sensory matrix overwhelmed by something vast and alien pressing against the edges of perception. For 3 seconds, every member of the High Council felt it, a presence turning its attention toward their sector of space, observing them with the detached interest of a researcher examining microorganisms under ancient glass. Then it withdrew, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any sound. The collective's gods, who had terrorized 100 species and never known fear themselves, now understood what their victims had felt. They were being watched by something that made them seem small. Back on Earth, the rebel leader received an encrypted transmission that made her question everything she thought she knew about the resistance. The message came from a collective ship, but the identification codes were wrong, deliberately so. Someone inside the enemy fleet was reaching out, not to surrender, not to threaten, but to warn. The transmission was brief, stripped of context to avoid detection, but its meaning burned clear. Humanity had damaged something that should not be damaged. The collective and Earth needed to stop fighting immediately, or something worse than either empire would emerge to silence them both. She stared at the message for hours, weighing its truth against the possibility of deception. The collective had used psychological warfare before, had sent false messages to resistance cells to sow confusion and distrust. But this felt different. There was panic in the transmission's underlying code, fear encoded in the frequency patterns. Whoever sent this believed it absolutely. The question was whether she could convince the humans to listen before they fired their gravitational weapons again. The engineer completed the power-up sequence on the newest warship, a vessel 3 times larger than the prototype, with gravitational lances that could theoretically tear apart entire fleets. The admiral had ordered maximum production, every resource diverted to creating a fleet that could face whatever the collective sent next. Earth's shipyards worked around the clock, building weapons that reached deeper into dimensional space with every iteration. They were getting better at it, more precise, able to fold reality with increasing sophistication. The engineer felt pride in the work, satisfaction in watching humanity's greatest achievement take shape in orbit. They had no idea they were building the exact thing that would force the sleeper in the dimensional depths to finally wake. The strategist received intelligence that the collective fleets were moving, all 3 staging points advancing toward Earth simultaneously. It was the assault they had been preparing for, the overwhelming force meant to crush humanity before they could spread their dangerous technology further. The timeline had been calculated precisely. 48 hours until the first wave arrived, 72 until Earth faced the largest military force the collective had assembled in 500 cycles. Every plan, every contingency, every desperate strategy came down to one simple truth. Humanity needed to fire every gravitational weapon they had, needed to tear open reality itself in a defensive barrage that would either save their species or doom them entirely. The admiral gave the order to prepare all warships for combat, to charge the gravitational lances to maximum power, to make ready for a battle that would decide not just humanity's fate, but potentially the fate of the entire galaxy. The crews moved the collective's armada emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system like a swarm of crystalline locusts. 300 warships arranged in formations that had crushed civilizations across the galaxy. The warlord commanded from the flagship, determined to prove that humanity's victory had been nothing but luck and surprise. This time, they came prepared with dimensional shields that should theoretically withstand gravitational attack, with weapons charged to levels that could crack planets, with the full might of an empire that refused to accept mortality. The fleet began its advance, moving inexorably toward the small blue world that had dared to make gods bleed. The admiral watched their approach from the command center, hand steady despite the weight of an entire species resting on the next few minutes. 37 human warships moved into defensive positions, a pitiful number compared to the enemy fleet, but each one carried enough gravitational force to fold space into impossible shapes. The firing solution was calculated, verified, and locked in. One word from the admiral, and humanity would unleash everything they had built, every weapon they had designed in secret, every desperate innovation born from 2 centuries of preparation. The word formed on tired lips, ready to condemn or save everything humans had ever been. Then the dimensional sensors screamed. Reality tore open between the 2 fleets, not from human weapons or collective technology, but from something else entirely. The structures the physicist had detected weren't just architecture. They were a vessel, or perhaps a being so vast that the distinction no longer mattered. It existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, its presence causing space itself to distort and fracture. To human eyes, it appeared as geometric impossibility, angles that couldn't exist in 3-dimensional space, forming patterns that hurt to perceive. To the collective's enhanced senses, it was worse, a vision of something so ancient that their entire civilization was little more than a brief moment in its awareness. The warlord tried to fire anyway, pride and fury overriding the primal fear that seized every crystalline nerve. The weapons charged, dimensional energy building to levels that should have reduced Earth's moon to cosmic dust. But when the firing command executed, nothing happened. The entity had reached into the ship's systems through dimensional pathways that the collective didn't even know existed, and simply turned them off. Not damaged, not destroyed, just deactivated, as casually as someone might extinguish a candle. 300 warships sat in space, suddenly as helpless as children's toys, their godlike technology rendered inert by something that operated on principles neither empire could comprehend. The Admiral made a decision that would define humanity's future. Against every tactical instinct, against the screaming voice of survival that demanded attack while the enemy was vulnerable, the order went out to power down all gravitational weapons. The captains hesitated, fingers hovering over controls that could end the collective threat forever. But the Admiral's voice cut through the chaos with iron certainty. Stand down. Humanity had come to the edge of extinction and found something worse than gods waiting in the dark. If they fired now, they wouldn't be defending themselves. They would be forcing the entity to choose between 2 irritating children, and nothing suggested it would choose to save either one. The eldest of the collective High Council did something that hadn't happened in 3,000 cycles. They transmitted directly to the human command center. No threats, no demands, just a simple acknowledgement of shared terror. Both civilizations had been playing with forces they didn't understand, tearing holes in reality like toddlers with knives, and the adult had finally stepped in to stop them before someone got hurt. The Council proposed an immediate ceasefire, not from weakness, but from the sudden understanding that their conflict was meaningless in the face of what existed in the dimensional depths. The rebel leader, monitoring the situation from her hidden base, watched in awe as 2 empires that had been seconds from mutual annihilation suddenly became very cooperative. Her resistance fighters stood in confused silence as broadcasts went out across collective space. The tributary species would be granted autonomy. The occupation forces would withdraw. The empire that had ruled through fear and claimed divinity was offering freedom not from kindness, but because they had finally met something that put their entire existence into perspective. She laughed until tears ran down her face, not sure if the sound carried joy or hysteria. The entity remained between the fleets for 17 minutes, its presence a constant reminder of how small they all were. Then it withdrew, not vanishing but rather folding back into the dimensional spaces it had emerged from, leaving behind sensor readings that suggested it had never actually left at all. It had simply stopped making itself visible, content to return to observation now that the disruptive children had learned their lesson. In the aftermath, as collective ships began their withdrawal and human vessels stood down from battle stations, the physicians' team analyzed what had happened. The entity hadn't communicated in words, but the meaning had been unmistakable. The dimensional spaces were not empty. They were inhabited, had always been inhabited, by things older and stranger than either humanity or the collective could imagine. The gravitational weapons, the regeneration networks, every technology that bent reality, all of it had been tolerated only because it remained small-scale and quiet. The war had made too much noise, torn too many holes, disturbed something that preferred to remain undisturbed. The Admiral sat alone in the command center as dawn broke over Earth, watching the last collective warship disappear into faster-than-light travel. Humanity had survived, but not through victory. They had been spared, allowed to continue existing by something that could have erased them as an afterthought. The question now was what they would do with that knowledge, how they would move forward knowing that the universe was far stranger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The strategist brought the final report, and its contents made the Admiral's blood run cold. The entity hadn't just warned them to stop fighting. It had left something behind, a structure forming in the dimensional space near Jupiter, growing larger with each passing hour. With practiced efficiency, checking systems and running final diagnostics on weapons that could kill gods. None of them noticed the dimensional sensors beginning to register something new, something massive stirring in the spaces between spaces, drawn by the promise of more gravitational disturbances, more tears in the fabric it had been sleeping within for eons, beyond counting .000 cycles, perfecting the art of conquest. In the deepest levels of the research facility, where even most military personnel weren't cleared to enter, the physicist stared at equations that suggested something impossible. The gravitational technology hadn't just disrupted the structure near Jupiter grew for 6 days before stabilizing into something that defied conventional description. The physicist led an international team studying it from every angle, using sensors that had been designed to detect collective technology, but now recorded something infinitely more complex. It wasn't a weapon, the data suggested, nor was it a monitoring station in any traditional sense. The best theory anyone could produce was that it served as a reminder, a permanent marker in humanity's solar system that they were being watched. The entity had made its point with subtlety. We allowed you to exist before, and we're allowing you to continue. But don't forget what happened when you got too loud. The collective's withdrawal transformed the galaxy in ways no one could have predicted. The warlord had been dissolved by order of the High Council, their consciousness scattered as punishment for nearly dooming their entire civilization. The eldest took direct control of the Empire's reformation, beginning the slow process of dismantling 3,000 cycles of oppression. It wasn't altruism that drove the change. It was survival instinct. The tributary species were granted independence, not because the collective suddenly developed morality, but because keeping them enslaved required the kind of large-scale dimensional technology that might attract unwanted attention from the depths. Better to release control voluntarily than risk another encounter with something that could turn off their immortality with a thought. The rebel leader found herself in the strangest position of her life, negotiating the terms of her world's freedom with the same empire that had murdered her family. The collective diplomat who met with her resistance council was younger, less arrogant, carrying the kind of humility that came from having your entire worldview shattered. They discussed reparations, technology transfers, and the logistics of withdrawal with a professionalism that felt surreal. At one point, she asked the diplomat if they felt any shame for what the collective had done to hundreds of worlds. The answer was honest in a way that might have been refreshing if it wasn't so bleak. The collective had believed themselves beyond morality, operating on a level where conventional ethics didn't apply. Now they understood they were just another species trying to survive in a universe that contained things far more powerful. Shame required the luxury of believing your actions mattered in some cosmic sense, and that luxury had been taken from them. Earth's military began the complex process of standing down from total war footing while simultaneously trying to understand what they had discovered. The Admiral retired 3 months after the crisis ended, too exhausted to continue carrying the weight of decisions that had nearly ended their species. The strategist took over command, implementing new protocols that governed the use of gravitational technology. Every experiment now required approval from an international council, and nothing was permitted that might disturb dimensional space beyond minimal thresholds. Humanity had learned to build weapons that could kill gods, but they had also learned that some weapons were too dangerous to use even when facing extinction. The engineer transformed the warship construction facilities into research stations, focusing on understanding dimensional physics without actually tearing holes in reality. It was delicate work, like trying to study a sleeping predator without waking it, but the knowledge gained proved invaluable. Within a year, human ships could travel between stars using gravitational principles that barely disturbed the dimensional fabric. They moved quietly through space, having learned the same lesson the collective had discovered millennia ago. The universe rewarded those who didn't make too much noise. First contact with the freed tributary species happened gradually, carefully, with humanity approaching as equals rather than conquerors or saviors. The diplomat, who had spent so long preparing for scenarios that never materialized, finally got to use those protocols in ways that felt meaningful. Trade agreements were established, cultural exchanges initiated, and slowly, cautiously, a new galactic community began to form. It was built on shared trauma, on the collective understanding that they all existed at the mercy of something larger, but it was real and growing stronger with each passing month. The medic published research on collective biology that revolutionized human understanding of regenerative medicine, though the quantum networking aspects remained theoretical. Some technologies were better left unexplored, lessons learned from watching an empire nearly destroy itself through overconfidence. Humanity could extend their lifespans, cure diseases that had plagued them for millennia, but they would do it quietly, carefully, without disturbing the fabric of reality itself. The scientist who had started everything by finding the weakness in collective immortality now taught at the academy, training the next generation of researchers. The lectures always included the same warning: intelligence without wisdom was just another form of ignorance. Humanity had been smart enough to build weapons that killed gods, but wisdom was understanding when not to fire them. The students listened with the reverence of people who had grown up knowing how close their species had come to extinction, how easily their victory could have become their funeral. On the anniversary of the battle that changed everything, memorials were held across Earth and throughout the freed worlds. They mourned the collective soldiers who had died believing they were immortal, the human crews who had faced impossible odds, and the countless beings who had suffered under oppression before anyone understood there was an alternative. The rebel leader gave a speech that was broadcast across dozens of systems, speaking about the strange path to freedom they had all walked. She thanked humanity not for saving them, but for being reckless enough to kick down a door that everyone else had been too afraid to touch. The structure near Jupiter remained, silent and inscrutable, a permanent reminder that humanity's place in the universe was smaller than they had once dreamed and stranger than they could have imagined. Ships passed it regularly, crews glancing at sensors that showed impossible geometry existing just outside normal space. Some found it terrifying. Others found it oddly comforting, proof that the universe was vast enough to contain wonders and horrors beyond human comprehension, and that perhaps the greatest wisdom was knowing when to be quiet and grateful for existence. The admiral, now retired and watching sunsets from a cabin that had belonged to their grandparents, received a final classified report. The entity's structure had begun emitting a signal, barely detectable, repeating a pattern that mathematicians were still trying to decode. It might be a message, or it might just be noise, but either way, it suggested that the watchers in the dimensional depths were still paying attention. Humanity had earned the right to exist in a galaxy full of mysteries, but that right came with the responsibility of remembering what happened when they got too proud. They had claimed to be ready for the stars, and the universe had tested that claim in ways no one could have predicted. They had passed barely, and now they carried forward with the humility of survivors who understood exactly how lucky they were to still be here, still breathing, still reaching toward tomorrow. Active's regeneration network. It had opened a window into the dimensional space where that network existed, and in that brief moment of exposure, the sensors had detected something. Structures, patterns, evidence of technology that made both human and collective achievements look like children playing with rocks. The physicist had spent 3 days checking and rechecking the data, hoping for a mistake, praying for sensor malfunction. But the numbers didn't lie. Something else was out there in the folded spaces between dimensions, something ancient and patient and watching, and humanity's war with the collective might have just woken it up. F screens, showing the dispersal patterns of human warships. The victory at the moon had been necessary, a message that needed to be sent, but it had also revealed humanity's hand far earlier than the original timeline had called for. The ship that destroyed the collective's first wave was their prototype, their proof of concept. The 37 vessels now stationed throughout the solar system represented the actual fleet, each one equipped with weapons that made the prototype look primitive by comparison. The admiral had read the historical files, had studied how empires fell. It was never the first blow that mattered most. It was what came after, when the enemy was reeling and trying to decide whether to flee or fight. The officer approached with the decoded message that collective surveillance hadn't realized humanity could intercept. The High Council was divided. Some wanted to retreat and regroup. Others wanted to come at Earth with everything they had. The Admiral smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach tired eyes. Let them come. Humanity had spent 200 years preparing for gods, and in that preparation, they had learned something the collective had forgotten in their millennia of easy conquest. Gods only seemed immortal until someone figured out how to kill them, and humans had always been exceptional at solving that particular problem. .S screamed across their empire's communication channels. The galaxy held its breath. The gods had bled. The immortals had fallen. And somewhere in that small corner of space, around an unremarkable yellow star, humanity was just beginning to show what 3,000 cycles of preparation could create. The collective's High Council convened for the first time in 500 cycles, and in the silence of that chamber, a question hung like a blade. If humanity could kill gods, what else were they capable of?